So, did you ever get the feeling that people were paying less attention, or?
People certainly did pay less attention after a while. I think a lot of it shifted to the funerals of the victims and the biographies of the victims. I mean, it was always in the media. It was always fairly current. The actual um, mechanics of recovering and identifying the remains were mostly kept away from the media, just to be merciful to the loved ones. The less detail I think that they knew about this, other than that we were making a massive effort, probably the better it was for the people who still had family members unrecovered or unidentified.
Now, in the present, if you look back on it, what memories come up from the events as a whole?
Um, a lot of us still meet. A lot of the people worked on the project. I was a tour commander, so I was in charge of about 25 dentists. Um, and, we worked together under these um, very difficult circumstances for a long time. So we get together from time to time, just reminisce a little bit about what our experiences were. Um, Names come up sometimes, um, in fact, this past weekend I ran into the brother and father of someone we had identified. Um, and so there are constant reminders. And of course, now the new structure has appeared on the skyline. So that brings back lots of memories of what went on there. So it's I wouldn't say it's ever present, but it's certainly something that occurs to me at a fairly high frequency, even this far out. I wish we could shut that.
Yeah,
Now it's off.
it is.
Yeah. No good.
Okay, yeah, it's still going.
So now, do you feel that you have a different perspective than the average person does about what had happened? Or do you feel like you have more insight about what had happened?
I don't think anyone who didn't actually see it can appreciate the magnitude of the tragedy. We physically handled the remains, X-rayed them, examined them, cataloged them. We got their dental records, but the dental record not only includes the X-rays, but also narratives by the dentist about what occurred during treatments. Lots of personal data, their addresses, where they worked, things like that. It made it very, very personal for me. The victims were maybe photos or media citations for the average individual. For us, they were real people. And very often you got a feel for the horrific circumstances of their deaths. I don't think anyone who didn't actually participate could ever appreciate just how devastating it really was, and just what the incredible numbers of individuals involved really was.
Do you think about the victims often, or do you try to block that out? And if you even could block that out, how would you?
Well, we had 4 patients from our practice who were lost, 2 of whom I was actually very friendly with. So I think about them from time to time. I still treat one victim's brother. And that victim was about 6 months away from retirement. He had just, made his final retirement plans. He was gonna move out of state and settle down. And so I knew a lot about what his plans were. And his plans just ended that day. He had no way of knowing that that was the last day of his life. You get glimpses of others sometimes. I don't know. There are little things just ring a bell for you, and you think about somebody you may have ID'd, or whose remains you may have seen there, or some family member who inquired about them. So yeah, there are frequent reminders.
And how frequent would you say this is on
Oh, it's more than once a week for sure.
Yeah.
Something always comes up that just brings back some memory of it.
Now, do you think that people should remember this as part of our history, just going on, like continuing now? Because I know, myself included, people weren't alive for the attacks. Do you think that they should try to keep it in their head of what had happened in our past?
It's a difficult question to answer. I don't think that the Trade Center will have will ultimately have the historic significance that something like Pearl Harbor had. Um, it was probably an equally horrific event. It wasn't really government-sponsored terrorism, and I don't know. I think the victims should be honored and remembered, but I don't think that long term it's going to be a major part of our history the way some other seminal events were in the past. I'm not convinced that it stays on, by the way, when the screen goes out.
Okay.
Because my face stops moving when it fades.
Okay.
So you have to see what the quality was.
Yeah. Okay. Do you feel like, when being a part of what had happened, do you feel like the U.S. government's response to the attacks was justified? Do you think going into Afghanistan and still being in Afghanistan now is justifiable for what had happened?
It's always hard to look back and make judgments about the appropriateness of what we did. I think at the time, I know at the time I supported that action, and I think it was appropriate. And Bin Laden ultimately was in Afghanistan. We had that intelligence. The Afghan government, or the Taliban at least, were using Afghanistan to harbor and train terrorists. So I think a fairly significant response was justified, and clearly it was appropriate to go after Bin Laden. I think trying to democratize Afghanistan subsequently was a noble and interesting idea. I don't know if anyone could have imagined how unworkable it turned out to be. And I don't know now whether we've done a good thing in that regard or not. I think it was important to give would-be terrorists a strong message that the U.S. would not tolerate it and would hunt them down wherever they went on Earth. And I don't think that was a bad message. So I think in general the response was appropriate at the time. I'm not sure we anticipated how costly and how difficult it was all going to be, however.
So if you would have anything to say in closing, what would you leave us with?
I would say, for me personally, the Trade Center was an incredibly sad event. I spoke with victims' families. I became familiar with a lot of the victims' personal histories, their backgrounds. As part of the identification effort, you just try to find out as much about them as you can. I don't know. I think the most moving thing for me was if they had appointment books or day books or tickets. A lot of them had tickets to Yankee games or Broadway shows or whatever in their personal belongings, and you just realized, this poor individual got up and went to work that day, had no idea that it was that it was the last day of his or her life, and I don't know the tragedy of that was just stuck with me forever. To this day, it was a meaningless, useless, awful thing to do to people who were completely innocent of any responsibility for whatever it was the terrorists were objecting to. the tragedy spread to their families and to their communities in a terrible way. I don't know. I just think about the uselessness of the whole act a lot. Now that I reflect upon it years later.
Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.